3. The Case of the Malingering Mango. The rescued mango pits mentioned in the introduction brought down on my still budding horticultural career the greatest possible catastrophe. Nothing happened. First thing in the morning, for weeks on end, I checked the soil in both pots carefully for signs of cracking or upheaval indicative of impending growth. But there was nary a sign of life. At last, in the second month, there did appear a small, slender green shoot in a pot most exposed to sun, which wasn't very much, the window facing north. It was obviously a weed, at most grass or some other misrepresentative seed that had made its way into the mango pot, but I couldn't yank it out after all. This laissez-faire philosophy of plant growing incidentally has become a mainstay of my botanical endeavors, always producing interesting, if not necessarily enviable, results. As it turned out, it was some kind of grass that had sprouted. 2 more months passed. I dug into the soil a bit to make sure the pits had not begun to rot. They were still there, big and firm, the beige, flattish ovals somewhat resembling oversized dried lima beans, sitting stolidly on end in the soil, hard as nuts. One had been planted with the eye indicating where the stem had held the fleshed fruit down, the other with it up. I had a sneaking suspicion that was where the first growth would occur, but was not at all sure which way it should have pointed. 3 months passed, and I admit I was discouraged. Other things seemed to be sprouting or growing well by now. Lemon, orange, and grapefruit trees, 2 pineapples, and a pomegranate were rising rustily out of the earth. Arthur the mango was getting almost out of hand, but still no mangoes. The lack of response became even more frustrating when driven at last to the library for research on dormant tendencies of this species. I discovered that the mango has been under successful cultivation for almost 4,000 years in its native region of northeastern India, Burma, and Thailand. It seems that Mughal Emperor Akbar, who reigned at Delhi in the late 1500s, was so taken with the mango's taste and fragrance that he had an orchard of over 100,000 trees laid out. This, spaced as mango trees properly, with 35 to 40 feet between them, must have been quite a sight at a time when large fruit orchards were almost unheard of. Even today, I mused, it would be most impressive. We are used to the low-spreading trees of temperate zone orchards, but the mango is a broad evergreen of deep, dark, shining foliage reaching up as high as 90 feet. A whole plantation of this fruit, the apple of the tropics as it is often called, would be something. However, all I wanted now was one sprout. Wistfully reading on in search of clues, I found that the mango has a delightful family tree, including among its relatives pistachio and cashew nuts, as well as the Japanese lacquer. The black sheep of the family, poison ivy, might have worried me a little if anything had sprouted, but since there was still no sign of life, I disregarded any possibility of the development of a throwback to this odious relative in my pot. It's well to note, however, that anyone sensitive to poison ivy should be on the lookout for reactions of a similar but generally lesser nature from handling or eating mangoes. The juice of the peel, in particular, can produce a rash. On the other hand, most people don't react to the juice of the pulp itself. I did learn one reason I might be having such difficulty. The mango seed retains its viability for a short time only. It seems that though for centuries the mango, with its strange, delicately flavored, brilliant orange fruit, was a delight of every Westerner who tasted it, the tree itself had not been grown outside its native region because the seeds would not remain fertile long enough to permit shipment any elsewhere. The Western Hemisphere, which had given the world so many fruits and vegetables, ranging from potatoes and corn to tomatoes and cocoa, didn't get the mango in return until the 18th century because the ships were too slow. Still, the time element shouldn't have affected my mangoes. They came by plane. Impatient, but trying to use great care, I again scratched away some soil to check one of my pits, just as many experienced gardener would tell me not to do. A small crack seemed to be developing along that edge of the pit where the heaviest concentration of the hairs or threads left from the fibrous fruit had been before. Was it just rotting or actively germinating? 2 weeks later, I had my answer. A 3-inch sprout, pale and skinny and bare, shooting up at the rate of almost half an inch a day. Of course, it was the pit with the eye down, so the plant had to grow in a complete U before surfacing, presumably taking twice as long as a pit planted eye up. Still, it had succeeded. When the sprout was about 4 inches tall, the first tiny leaves, 4 of them all told, began to extend themselves in the form of a graceful crown at the apex. They were a surprising, deep, shiny crimson, delicate and drooping. As the leaves grew longer, these first ones to about 3 inches, they turned slowly and subtly dark green, at the same time hardening and losing their droop to arch out almost horizontally. With its long stem and crown of leaves, my mango in its early stage looked like a miniature palm. A few mangoes later, I came up with one that didn't look like a miniature palm, but a whole oasis of lopsided ones. I had 4 separate trunks coming out of one pit. I've since found out that this type of multiple mango is not too infrequent. Although professionals recommend cutting back all but one of the shoots for maximum growth, leaving only one main trunk, I find that letting them develop their own split personalities adds interest and variety. The mango I discovered quite by accident and much to my distress is much more frost sensitive than many other tropical or semi-tropical evergreens, such as citrus fruit. In the beginning, all my plants sat on the windowsill for maximum light, which even in wintertime seemed to do them no harm, since the heat circulation throughout the apartment is quite thorough. Indeed, the warmth, according to Susan, is a real fringe benefit of my tropical gardening bug. Before being bitten by it, I habitually slept with the windows open all winter. Still, even with the windows closed and carefully corked against winter drafts, accidents will happen. One morning on my daily inspection, I found all the leaves on the window side of the mango turning brown and shriveling up. I had been rotating the plant to coax it to grow straight, Left to themselves on the sill, the plants all bent towards the light, threatening to become permanently deformed, and the leaves had come to rest on the cold glass and been frostbitten. I lost my first and favorite mango that way and had to start all over again. Although my mango pits have sometimes taken 4 months to sprout, I've had others begin their growth in a matter of weeks. Even using the ripest fruit available, however, I've never been able to get more than 75% of them to germinate. The first thing to remember in cultivating mangoes is to remove the fruit from the pit as completely and carefully as possible, first scraping the pit with a knife and then using an old toothbrush and lukewarm water to scrub off what flesh remains along the hairs. The hairs themselves will not come off and may be left for planting. If you're worried about the skin reaction, rubber gloves can be worn when cleaning the pits. Once removed from the fruit, the pit should be left in a warmish spot to soak, fully covered with water for about 5 days. Change the water every day, keeping it tepid to avoid stagnation. After its baby bath, the pit is ready for planting high up, about half an inch below the surface of a very loose, loamy soil. The seed should not be laid flat, but placed on end. If it lies flat, the water tends to collect on top of it, sometimes inducing rotting instead of germination. As with any seed, it's a must to water the mango very heavily on planting. The soil may in fact be allowed to turn almost to mud. After a few days, when the surface has begun to feel dry again, I begin regular watering using lukewarm water. Tepid water is almost always best. This is true not only for tropical plants which are sensitive to cold, but with rare exceptions for potted plants in general. In tropical countries, plants may be showered every day during the rainy season, but nature supplies other conditions the great indoors does not. As a result, it's not the best idea to water plants or seeds every day, even if it seems more natural. One of the easiest absent-minded habits that after-dinner gardener can slip into is overwatering. Usually twice a week is sufficient, except in a very dry apartment. I use an old teapot for watering, but to avoid disturbing the soil and perhaps exposing roots close to the surface, I pour the water slowly around the edge of the pot. The soil should appear to readily absorb the moisture. Under no circumstances should it become so wet that water is left standing on the surface. I supplement this regular procedure once every 2 weeks by watering from the bottom, pouring water into the drainage dish until it is no longer absorbed, then draining off the excess. One of the few exceptions I make to this rule of thumb in watering is the mango. A mango tree will not flower or fruit unless it goes through a dry season reminiscent of its native tropical environment, I learned. Although none of mine has flowered yet, it takes about 4 years, and mine, being indoor plants, probably never will. I took this bit of information to heart from the beginning, thinking the seasonal effect might also aid its other stages of growth. I let the soil go dry for a week every month. Then I water it quite heavily for the rest of the month, which is not the way nature runs its wet and dry seasons, but my mangoes thrive on it. Mangoes grow in spurs. After a dormant period from 4 to 6 weeks, a new bunch of dark red leaves will suddenly crown the tree, hurriedly extend themselves to their proper slim lengths, which after the first year's growth of a plant is about 8 inches, fading in the process to a pale rose green, then gradually forming and darkening to blend in with the older leaves. As for us, while we found the mango one of the most attractive of indoor trees due to a private impasse, we've temporarily given up eating the fruit. Susan likes hers somewhat on the underripe side, whereas the seed is more apt to germinate when the fruit is completely ripened. And I can't bear to waste pits by premature eating when almost every time we have guests, they walk away with one of the trees as if they had never had a pit of their own to plant.